Why was Nietzsche interested in suffering, and how did he connect this with gods?
The monotheistic religions he gives a slightly different spin on, but it's a version of the same story. But there, the idea is the more familiar one that we suffer in this world in order to make it more likely that we are rewarded in an afterlife.
Welcome to the Neutral Ground. One of my favorite moments in class, when I used to have more opportunities to teach philosophy, was reading Sartre's Existentialism and Humanism with my students, and then discussing the simultaneous feelings of freedom and captivity when one decides to become fully responsible for his or her existence. This is an incredibly complex topic, as there are definitely moments in life when we feel that the world is conspiring against us and that we have very little choice in our actions. However, the existentialists would still push back against that statement. And in this episode, we're going to talk about why that is the case. This week, we've invited an expert on the topic to help us navigate through the existential world, Dr. Joel Smith. Joel Smith is a philosophy lecturer at the University of Manchester. He works mostly on the philosophy of mind and phenomenology. He's written a remarkably clear book, and when your book is about philosophy, clarity is the highest compliment you can pay an author. Joel has written a wonderful book entitled Existentialism, a Philosophical Inquiry. I highly recommend it for anyone interested in learning more about the topic. We wrestle with names like Sartre, Nietzsche, Heidegger, de Beauvoir, and Kierkegaard, and we try to learn why we self deceive, how to construct meaning today, how we can push back against the prevailing nihilism we feel, and a lot more. Before we dive into what is a fantastic episode, if you have not yet hit the subscribe/follow button and joined our community of people who value civil discourse, do so now. Put your existential agency into action. We appreciate the support. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Joel Smith. Joel, welcome to the Neutral Ground. We're going to be discussing existentialism and philosophy, and we'll be doing so with your book as our guide, Existentialism, a Philosophical Inquiry. I want to begin our conversation with a little bit of clarification. You resist defining the term existentialism in the book because you want to avoid the potential for the term to lose all of its meaning, which is something that we're going to be talking about actually in a little bit. However, for the sake of our conversation today, let me ask, how are you approaching the term existentialism as it relates to your work? What are the primary principles of this philosophy?
Thanks, and thanks very much for inviting me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure. So I think of existentialism as not really as a philosophical theory, but rather as an approach to a set of philosophical questions. And it's distinctive in the sense that you can typically recognize when a philosopher is an existentialist or is pursuing existential issues or pursuing philosophical questions in an existentialist way. But it isn't, as I say in the book, I don't think it's straightforward to define it as you can define various other isms in philosophy. So I think of it as a philosophical tradition, and this really the central figures are Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So with those two philosophers writing in obviously the first half of the 20th century, and then a constellation of people either side of them in time. There's some people working around the same time, but so figures earlier than them, obvious candidates to sort of warrant the title existentialist are certain a period of Heidegger's work, and then before him Kierkegaard, and then certain elements of Nietzsche, and then after Sartre and de Beauvoir, well, sort of simultaneously, but slightly later, Frantz Fanon. There's also a colleague of Sartre's, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's perhaps less well known than them, but was sort of one of their interlocutors. So I think of these people as interested in a whole range of things, and not all of the things that they're thinking about are sort of special to existentialists, but what marks them out as pursuing an existential approach to philosophy is they're interested in what it is for somebody to live a life. So philosophers are sometimes quite focused on somewhat abstract questions that are reasonably far away from everyday concerns that people might have when they're engaged in their ordinary lives, and that's fine. But the existentialists wanted to, if you like, bring philosophy down to earth. So do philosophy in such a way that it was relevant to people who wanted to know what was the best way to lead their lives. And that's very clear with the late 19th century or mid to late 19th century philosophers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. A little bit less clear perhaps with some of the 20th century work, since if you read Sartre as being a nothingness, it's very abstract, and a lot of it is anyway. But at various points makes connection to sort of issues that are important to people in thinking about how to sort of pursue what you might, very vaguely speaking, think of as the good life, how it is that one ought to live. And I guess if there's a sort of a single idea or claim that's has some claim to be the guiding thought behind existentialism, is this slogan that you find in Sartre's Existentialism and Humanism, which is that existence precedes essence, which is, I think, like, widely misunderstood, or just not really. People aren't entirely sure what to make of it, which is a problem, because if that's the central idea of existentialism, or one of them at least, then we need to have some sense of what it might mean.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be getting to that because yeah, you talk quite a bit about that in the book, and and I think you're right. I think in some ways, because it has become such a readily available term that people throw out there, we definitely run the risk of losing the complexity and the nuance that Sartre uses there for that, and just how important that is for understanding his basic case for existentialism as well. But you went back a little bit. You talked about history. I'd like to take this back even a little bit further if we can. The roots of existentialism actually stretch pretty far back into the Enlightenment as well, to a degree. Can you talk a little bit about the role that Enlightenment thinking, specifically Kant, played in the initial development of the existential philosophical tradition?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm not a historian. I should say it at the start. So, what I can say about Kant and Hegel is the other major figure, as I see it, is is not scholarly, uh, but it's clear to me that there are certain elements of Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy that are very important for all of the existentialists. I mean, they were enormously important for philosophers, just full stop. But I think that they do play a significant role in existential philosophy. So I think that the central importance of Kant comes out in, I guess, two ways. One is the very idea of the Enlightenment. And so Kant wrote this essay on the Enlightenment, um, in which he essentially said that what enlightenment involves is thinking for yourself. It's quite straightforward. It's not especially complex. I mean, Kant is well known for being impenetrable, but this essay isn't impenetrable at all. And the essential idea is that enlightenment thinking means not taking anything on authority, essentially. So when it comes, for example, to thinking about ethics, thinking about the good life, what is the right way to live, you ought not to simply accept on the authority of whoever it may be an answer to a question like that, but rather ought to think it through for oneself. And that's, as Kant thought of it, just a sign of like the move from just taking things on authority to thinking them through for oneself, as he puts it, bringing it to the tribunal of reason, is like the move from childhood to adulthood, like from immaturity to maturity. So he thinks of the Enlightenment as really culture and philosophical culture, specifically becoming mature. So not thinking in a dogmatic way. I mean, that's all very vague, and it's not something that anyone's going to disagree with. But it does play an important role in a lot of what happens in the detail of some bits of existential philosophy, where the role of thinking for oneself, making decisions without basing them on the authority of someone else, plays an important part. And the other element of Kantian philosophy that's really important is his ethics, and in particular the centrality that he thinks freedom or autonomy has in ethical thinking. So, I mean, his ethics are quite complicated and difficult, but there's a one of the central ideas is that when making ethical choices, right, when deciding what is the right thing to do, we have to be, as he sometimes puts it, self-legislators. That is, we have to act according to a rule, but where that rule is one that we determine for everybody and that binds us. So we bind our own will by acting in a certain way, a way such that we think that everybody ought to act in that way. And that's like central to the notion of moral action, is this universality. We think that if something is a moral reason, it ought to apply to everybody equally. And that's something which has autonomy or freedom at the center of it, for the reason that the rules that we think, or the legislation that we think are that are binding on us in acting morally, are things which we apply to ourselves autonomously. So we're supposed to freely bind our own wills in order to act in a moral way. And that can sound kind of paradoxical, but that notion of freedom or autonomy at the center of Kantian moral philosophy is really important for the existentialists. So all of them, I think, really think of freedom as absolutely central to the human experience, and certainly as the key value against which you can measure all sorts of other values.
Yeah, in that sense, you can see a fairly straight line between Kant and what Sartre talks about in existentialism and humanism, in terms of, if you believe that, and I'll paraphrase here, But if you believe that it is right for you to be, or to make the decision to be a Christian, act as Christian, that in some way you're involving all of humanity, you're saying it is right then for all to be that, or to fashion oneself in that way. You you touch upon in the book the complex relationship that we have as a species with truth and value. Let's start getting down into some of the more specifics here. When I've pushed my students to expand upon the value of truth, they often become quite confused and even irritated, to a degree, as if to ask such a question is like to challenge the nature of the divine in many ways. Um, you bring in Kierkegaard's notion of the importance of inwardness and his story of the man who has escaped from an asylum and is trying to blend into the crowd. I think this story is a good way for us to enter into a discussion about the relationship between truth and value. Can I ask you to summarize Kierkegaard's story of the escaped man and then discuss what it reveals to us about the importance of inwardness as it relates to the relationship between truth and value?
Sure. So yeah, so Kierkegaard has this section in his one of his works, unscientific. Sorry, my brain's just disappeared. What's it called? Sorry, I know you're recording this.
That's okay. This is being human.
Including unscientific postscript. Sorry. Where he distinguishes between the objective way and the subjective way of thinking about truth. And what he's really interested in is attitudes towards truth rather than what truth is or anything like that. So there's a sort of a standard philosophical question asking about what truth is, and that's not really his primary interest. So the primary interest is how we relate to truth. And one of the things he talks about is this story about someone who's escaped from a madhouse and is trying to convince people that that he's not mad. And he thinks, okay, well, what I need to do is say lots of true things. And so he says lots of true things that are completely irrelevant to the context in which he finds himself. So I think in the story, he just keeps repeating that the earth is round. And of course, that's precisely a good way to convince people that you're mad rather than that you're sane. Because ordinarily, when you're engaged in conversation, you want your conversation to be relevant. And he's not relevant. He's just saying things that are true, but that are of no consequence to anybody in the context. And Kierkegaard's thought there is that what the madman is doing is concerning himself in an objective way with the truth, and what he really should be doing is concerning himself in a subjective way with the truth. And what Kierkegaard means by that, at least as I read him, is that to concern yourself in an objective way is just to try to believe truths, and obviously that's something that most of us think is a good thing. Believing the truth is, by and large, better than believing falsehoods. But it's important that we do more, Kierkegaard thinks, than simply believe truths. And what matters is that we have a certain level of commitment, or as he sometimes describes it, it's important that we have inwardness, or a subjective attitude towards the truth. And as I understand that as being essentially the idea that it's important to believe truths that we care about. So the madman, in uttering that repeatedly that the earth is round, doesn't care about the thing that he's saying, right? He's saying it for some other reason, to convince somebody of something. And lots of people believe all sorts of things, but don't really care about those things, aren't committed to those beliefs. The important thing for Kierkegaard is to have a certain level of commitment. And the reason why he thinks this is important he's a religious thinker primarily, so his main concern is with Christianity specifically, and he's concerned that people think that they're being Christian if they accept certain claims about the nature of the universe and our place in it. But that's wrong, he thinks. What it is to really be a Christian is to commit one's life to Christianity, and that's quite different. So it's entirely possible to claim to be a Christian, but let that have very little influence on how one actually lives one's life. And that person is not, as he puts it, in the truth in a subjective way. Even though what they believe is, by his lights, true, because he is a Christian, he doesn't think that they're doing it in the right way. Whereas a person could believe by his lights, a false religion, but nevertheless do it with commitment, right? Do it in such a way that it informs their life. It affects how they live their life and what they do on a daily basis. And that person is, even though they believe, again, by Kierkegaard's lights, falsehoods, nevertheless, that person is in the truth in a subjective way. That connects up with various ideas in existentialist thinking. Most noticeably, I think, when, or coming back to the thing I mentioned earlier, Sartre's idea that existence precedes essence, what people often forget is that immediately after that, he says, or in other words, that we must begin from the subjective. So he seems to think that of those two things as essentially saying the same thing. And I think at least part of what he means there can be thought of in Kierkegaardian terms, right? So the idea is that there's a certain primacy to subjectivity or subjective thinking, whereby that is thought of as implicating a certain level of care or commitment to our projects, our decisions, and our beliefs, rather than being concerned primarily with objective truths.
This section, actually, I reread it. I read it 2 times and then went through it again a third time just to make sure, because it made me think of, I'll go ahead and I'll admit a failure on my part pedagogically, because when we talk about facts and the importance of facts and data and information in my class, something that I try to get across to my students, and now I think you've provided me with a better way in to this, is this idea of how do we value a fact? Today, we talk a lot about valuing facts, right? But what I try to get across to my students is, okay, yes, facts are a part of the toolbox that we use to have conversations, meaningful conversations, but they're not the only tools in meaningful conversations. We do have to take into consideration other rhetorical tools that we use to coordinate with each other. And so, what I tried to do that did not work out that well, and I'll ask you, when you teach this, how does it work for you, or how do you approach it? I forgot what the example was that I gave, but I had 2 students generate facts that seemed in opposite to each other, to the main point. And then I asked the rest of the class, I said, okay, both of your colleagues here have facts. So who are you going to side with? If we boil everything down too simply, trust the person who's speaking the facts, we have 2 facts here. Who are you going to go with? And I thought that they would look at that and see, oh, okay, now I understand. There's there does need to be other aspects besides just facts. And this section of your book, again, gives me, I think, a different way in to talk about this, the subjective and the objective, with Kierkegaard, and to talk about relevancy, how it's relevant. Can I ask you, pedagogically, when you approach something like this, how do you approach teaching a concept like valuing truth with your students?
Yeah, so I mean, the task you gave your students sounds to me like really the task there is to evaluate evidence or something like that. So if you have two claims and they're inconsistent with one another, and you need to decide which one you believe, then the job looks to me really like determining whether there are any good arguments in favor of one, objections to the other, whether there's more evidence for one than there is for the other, and so on. So that's like a factual inquiry. That's the sort of thing that, as I understand him, Kierkegaard thinks of as being relating to the objective way. So we're interested. We're trying to work out what is true, um, and that's a good thing to do. That's what I spend most of my time doing. What I think Kierkegaard is trying to focus on, though, is the thought that, look, even if we all agree what the facts are, so suppose there is some fact that everybody believes. Say, when I was writing this book, it was during the pandemic, and when we were all, shut inside our houses. There was all sorts of claims about the risks involved in various different types of activity, and everybody says, "Oh, it's important to follow the science." But following the science is more than just believing that what the scientists say is true. So we can believe that what the scientist says is true. So the scientist says, well, this sort of behavior carries a certain level of risk. And that sort of behavior carries a greater level of risk. Suppose we all agree on those facts. The question is still open whether we ought to pursue the first or the second type of behavior. Why is that? Because it's not settled what type of risk is acceptable to us. And different people might have different views about what type of risk is acceptable to you. And the thought there is that there's more required than simply believing truths. What you need to do is engage those truths, those facts, with what it is that matters to you, right? What you care about, what your preferences, what your passions, as Kierkegaard would put it, are. So if you care more about risk than someone else, then you're going to behave in a different way. But both of you could be, in a certain sense, following the science. You're both aware of what the science tells you, and you think that a certain level of risk is worth it, given what you can achieve by doing this, whatever thing it might be, going to the shops. And another person does not think that, and so you end up doing different things. So the thought would be that no matter how much objective information you have, no matter how many true beliefs you have, you still don't yet have a guide to action. This is a point really that goes back much further, all the way back at least to David Hume, which is something I mentioned in the book. So Hume has this famous phrase that says, reason is only a slave to the passions. So reason is the objective stuff, the objective way, finding out what the truths are. And the passions are the things that motivate you, the things that move you to action. But the reason, in Hume's view at least, can't tell you what to do. It can only tell you, if you want to do this, here's how to go about doing it. It's passion that tells you what to do. And different people just have different preferences. Different people just have different passions. Um, what you really want, Kierkegaard thinks, is to get your beliefs, your objective truths, in line in the right way with your passions, with your cares, such that the things that you believe are things that you fundamentally care about, um, rather than simply things that you accept as truths but play no particular role in the way in which you go about living your life. So I guess, I mean, to come back to your actual question, how do I teach this stuff? I think that thinking about the relationship between belief and desire, or belief and preference, belief and passion, is important. Um, the thought that we could all believe exactly the same things and yet seemingly perfectly reasonably do different things is an important one. I think as much as anything else, it gets you to see that people aren't necessarily being irrational because they have different pursue a different agenda than you, and they don't necessarily. It's not necessarily that they believe something that's not true. They just have different preferences than you.
I have just one quick follow up here to something you mentioned, and then I want to move into Nietzsche a little bit, his role in this as well. Did you find during the height of the pandemic, did you find trying to teach that philosophical nuance and trying to teach kind of how reason and passion both work together? Did you find it to be a little bit more difficult, or did you actually find it to be quite comforting? Did the students think it was comforting to think about what was going on in this philosophical lens?
I'm not sure. I mean, it was different, that's for sure, because obviously all the teaching went online, so everything was via Zoom, and that made it more difficult in some respects. I think it's just difficult to communicate to people uh, in the same way remotely uh, as than in the classroom. Um, but I mean, that's a relatively trivial point. I think that the answer to your question is I'm not really sure the extent to which the students found it comforting. It's certainly true that a lot of these issues that we talked about, or that we talk about when I teach this course, um, seem to be particularly pertinent in the time of the pandemic. I think it was a period of time when a lot of people were reassessing how they wanted to live their lives. Because our lives changed, everybody's life changed quite a lot during that period. And a lot of people got, if you like, sort of jolted out of a routine, and students as much as anybody else. And many of those people reassessed what it was that they really wanted to do. And as much as anything else, this course on existentialism that I teach is about assessing what it is that you really want to do. So I think that a lot of the issues were felt like relevant to them at that time. I hope they still do now, of course.
Yeah, I think it probably did bring a fair amount of them some comfort, honestly, to be able to engage it, because there's also there's a lot of power in engaging, of course, things that are confusing or can potentially frighten you, and of course trying to think about your meaning and the relationship between reasons and your passions and all these different things, of course, can be quite intimidating for people, young adults especially. As we both know, they're dealing with so much already. This is a heavy task, but it's a good one for them. It's a great one for them to wrestle with, honestly. um, okay, so I want to spend a few questions here on Nietzsche. And I want to begin with probably what is, as you say in your book, even his most famous proclamation. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche famously, through his madman, proclaims the death of God and that we have killed him. As you note, this is, probably what most people know him for. However, there is a tremendous amount of complexity here that emerges out of this statement that connects with existentialism and particularly Sartre, which we'll connect with Sartre more specifically a little bit later on in this. Nietzsche was very much interested in this connection between humans and suffering. And he saw a particular role that gods or has played in this relationship. Why was Nietzsche interested in suffering, and how did he connect this with gods?
Yeah. So I think that Nietzsche was interested in suffering just because there's so much of it. Uh, you know, there's suffering throughout history. If you only need to read history of it, pretty much any period, and it's just a relentless tale of pain and suffering. And his concern was how we can manage to go on living our lives in the face of this sort of onslaught of awfulness. And what he thought was that, like, suffering is very bad, but we can cope with it if we think that it's for a reason. So we make ourselves suffer if we think that it's for good reason. You go to the gym, and you don't necessarily enjoy going to the gym, but you're doing it in order to achieve some goal, right? No pain, no gain. So you think, well, okay, suffering is made less bad if we can think of it as having a justification in that way. And that's his explanation of religion, essentially. He thinks, look, all sorts of there's so much suffering in the world that can't be given a straightforward worldly explanation. Like, that suffering is okay because it created this good outcome. There's all sorts of terrible things happen in the world that can't, it seems, be justified in that way. This is sometimes known as the problem of evil in the philosophy of religion, right? So, and there, the thought is that's a reason to think that there is no benevolent God, because given all of this unjustifiable evil, a benevolent God would prevent it. But that's not quite Nietzsche's thought. Nietzsche's thought is that there's a sociological explanation that can be given of why it is that we believe in God or gods, which is that it justifies the suffering, or gives meaning to the suffering that we undergo in life. And there's various different versions of that. So his explanation of the ancient gods seems to be that they enjoy watching us suffer. Their attitude towards us is one of cruelty, or they watch us like we might watch a play or Netflix. Right? So we're enjoying watching fictional characters suffer on TV. The gods are enjoying watching mortals suffer, and that, although it doesn't seem like a very pleasant explanation, is at least an element of Nietzsche's explanation of the genesis of the ancient gods, is the thought that, suffering is bad, but at least it's serving that function. It's for a reason. The monotheistic religions, he gives a slightly different spin on, but it's a version of the same story. But there, the idea is the more familiar one, that we suffer in this world in order to make it more likely that we are rewarded in an afterlife. So, the bad things that happen in this world are made up for by what goes on in the afterlife. And Nietzsche thought that just that recognition that there's this sociological story that says, look, here we are, we're confronted with meaningless suffering. That suffering would be more bearable to us if we could give it an explanation. Here's an explanation, a supernatural one, that says that suffering can't be justified by any ordinary, mundane means, but can be justified if we think of it in supernatural terms. So we're going to invent gods or God. He thinks that the very existence of that sort of explanation should lead us to be highly dubious about religion, highly dubious about the sort of the metaphysical element of monotheistic religion, the idea that there is a God. And that's not for the same reason as the problem of evil says, look, God is good. God, if God was all powerful, he should be able to prevent suffering, and he doesn't. Therefore, there probably isn't one. It's rather a sociological sort of undermining of the belief. It says that your belief that there is a God really has nothing to do with whether or not it's true that there's a God. It's all about serving this psychological function of making suffering bearable. And so that's, as I see it, at least the sort of the core line of thought that leads up to this idea that God is dead, whereby that really means that, you know, we educated late 19th century intellectuals can't take the idea of God seriously anymore. So the idea of religion and everything, importantly, that stems from it, and he thought that was a lot, needs to be rethought.
So let's extend this a little bit then further, right? Because as you started to allude to toward the end there, it's not as simple as saying, okay, God is dead, but you know what? We can't take it seriously anyway. The existence, there are ramifications for this. Um, I want to bring in a term that many people have probably heard of before, but I think it also falls under that category of, I think it's lost a little bit of its meaning and maybe a little bit of its context the more that it gets used in terms of popular culture, and that is nihilism. So I don't know about you, but I would say probably at least once a semester, I'll have a student who will just proudly proclaim, I'm a nihilist. And I tend to say, okay, I'm interested. I'm in. Let's sit down and let's talk about it, what it actually is, what it means, and then I'm curious to see if you still would consider yourself a nihilist after this. And normally after these conversations, the student will either say, "Oh well, no, I'm not. I guess I'm not that serious," or they'll soften it up quite a bit, right? And so something that I like to do, or that I'd like to do here, is let's go ahead and let's nail this down a little bit. What is nihilism, and how does this concept emerge in Nietzsche's mind?
Yeah, so I mean, Nietzsche was really concerned with nihilism. As I understand him, his primary goal, really, in all of his philosophical work, was trying to find a way of avoiding nihilism. He thought nihilism was really bad. But that's very confusing because he's also often thought of as a nihilist in certain ways. And so I think of him as someone who thought that there was a really serious threat that nihilism was the consequence of the death of God, and then tried to think of some way of avoiding this. So what is nihilism? It's lots of different things. So that's part of the problem. So in the book, I distinguish between two different ideas that can both perfectly reasonably be called nihilism. There are others, but I just focused on these two. So one has specifically to do with morality. The moral nihilist is somebody who says that there are no moral facts, or there are no moral truths. There is no such thing as objective right and wrong, good and bad. These are, well, there's various different ways of explaining what we're doing when we talk about morality, if you're a nihilist. But definitely what we're not doing is asserting truths. And there's an intuitive line of thought that goes from the death of God to moral nihilism, which is, roughly speaking, the reason why the moral truths are as they are is because God made it so. Right? So the explanation of morality is religion, essentially. And although I suspect there's not so many people in philosophy departments who think that something like that is true, I think that perhaps if you get out in the real world, there are people who think like something like that is true, that somehow the foundation of morality is religion. And if you think, of course, that there is no God, and you also thought that the foundation of morality is God, then morality looks like it's in trouble. There are well-known ways of countering that line of argument. The most famous is Euthyphro. So the Euthyphro dilemma says that religion really can't be the source of morality for the following reason. So this is Socrates' question to Euthyphro. He says, is something good? Well, he doesn't put it quite this way, but he says, here's a question, here's a dilemma for you. Is something good because God loves it, or does God love it because it's good? So which direction does the explanation go in? And whichever way you choose seems a problem. So if you say God loves, I don't know, whatever it might be, helping those in need because it's good, then you've not explained morality in terms of religion. Right? You've said that it's good independently of what God thinks, and God then, of course, since God only believes true things, believes that it's true. So you've given up on that horn of the dilemma. You've given up on the idea that morality really is grounded in religion. But on the other horn of the dilemma, you say, oh no, well, it must be the other way around then. It must be that it's good because God loves it. Well, if that's the right way to think of it, it seems that God has no reason to love that thing rather than something else. Right? God could have made it true that helping those in need is bad, is wrong, and murdering innocent people is the right thing to do. Because God's decision about which things were going to be right or wrong wasn't grounded in the things themselves on this view. It was grounded in just his decision. And that seems to be completely wrong. Right? God, it looks like, wouldn't just be the sort of person, or is God a person, wouldn't be the sort of entity that just makes things up in that way based on no reasons. God rather looks like they ought to have been responding to some fact about the actions in question, like murdering versus helping. Right? One of those was chosen to be the thing that's good for a reason. So both horns of the dilemma have a problem. One seems to have given up on the idea that religion is what grounds morality, and the other just seems to make morality completely arbitrary. But that's not what the person who believes that religion is the foundation of morality tends to want to believe. So all of that sort of got carried away on that line. All of that is a reason to think that, oh, maybe moral nihilism doesn't follow from the death of God after all. Maybe moral nihilism doesn't follow from the death of God for the reason that God wasn't the source of morality in the first place. So you might think, oh, Nietzsche's worry is a bit misplaced. or is overblown at least. Um, but as I see it, there is a version of that worry which isn't misplaced and is quite, and it's something that we need to take seriously, which is that even if you're convinced by the Euthyphro argument, the best it looks like you can conclude from it is that some things are good or bad, independent of what God thinks. Okay. The goodness and badness of things does not have its source in religion. But that doesn't tell us which things are good and bad. It doesn't tell us how it is that we ought to live our lives. It doesn't tell us how we ought to act in any specific circumstance. But we do have quite specific beliefs about which things are right, which things are wrong, what are the virtues, what are the vices, and so on. And so there's a question of how it is that we come to believe those things. How is it that we come to believe the particular moral claims that we do? And there you might think, oh, religion plays quite an important role there. So, for each individual, it might be the case that by and large, their beliefs about what's right and wrong are the result of all sorts of bits of training that they receive when they're children, facts about the culture, generally speaking, watching Disney movies, all sorts of things that tell you how to behave. But so for each individual, it's not like they have read a religious text and decided as a result to adopt a certain moral perspective. But what's in the culture, what's floating around in the prescriptions that your parents gave you, which they got from their parents, which they got from theirs, and so on, they look like they're very heavily influenced by religious claims about morality. Not in a direct way, it's definitely in an indirect way, but certainly it would be, I think, brave to deny that Christianity has had an enormous influence on the sort of moral atmosphere that you get in countries that have been predominantly Christian for a long time. And there you get the worry again, right? So that the death of God says, oh, but all of that was had a foundation which was unreal, right? Since there is no God, or we have no reason to believe in God, all of the moral teaching that has been so influential on us needs to be rethought. And so maybe you don't get to all the way to moral nihilism, but you certainly get to something like a skeptical attitude towards the sorts of moral claims that we might ordinarily take for granted.
Yeah, and I take this idea very seriously, and you don't spend a tremendous amount of time in this particular section in your book, but there's a part where you talk about what can we do? What would, let's say, modern atheists turn to, as a method for dealing with the potential uh, kind of falling into a nihilistic state? And you mentioned two things. You talk about grand narratives, turning to grand narratives, and you mention staying busy or occupied in some way, right? And that struck me because I tend to talk quite a bit on this show about neo-modern culture today and our turning back toward grand narratives in the wake of kind of that postmodern skepticism of grand narratives. I think today we're looking to be reassured by narratives again, and so you made me think about, okay, there is a way that you can turn toward grand narratives and get that reconnection, I think, with a moral history of humanity, with the establishment of it. And of course, as everybody knows, the explosion of content creation and streaming services boy, does that ever keep us busy. When we're not doing something else, we're, just sitting there and watching something. And so you really made me think about how we're dealing with this potential problem today of nihilism in those two ways. I want to use this to sort of transition into the 20th century existentialists here by asking, so how did people like Sartre, how did de Beauvoir, how did they respond to Nietzsche's worries about this nihilistic state?
Yeah, so I think that I mean, certainly both Sartre and de Beauvoir accept uh, Nietzsche's atheism, and both of them think that this has significant consequences for ethical thinking. Perhaps not for exactly the same reasons as Nietzsche or exactly the same reasons as I've sketched out, but nevertheless, they thought it was important. So at one point, Sartre says that existentialism is just the working out of a consistent atheism. Now, I think that that's an overstatement, or that's one of his classic claims that you have to take with a bit of a pinch of salt. But nevertheless, it was certainly central to his overall philosophical approach, and it connects back to this idea that I've mentioned but haven't really tried to explain yet, that existence precedes essence. So way to think about this, in my view, is if you think that there is a God and God created us in his image, then there will be a right and a wrong way to be as a human being. In the book, the word I used was blueprint for this. So there would be a blueprint for the good life, and our job is to A, work out what that is, and then B, do it. But if you don't think that there is a God who designed us with a certain function or blueprint in mind, then you don't have that sort of religious moral guide. This connects up with the existence and essence idea, because one way to think about the notion of an essence for human beings would be a religious way that says, look, there's an essential nature that we have as children of God, and our task is to live up to that, right? To live in accordance with the way that God has ordained for us. That would be our essence. And on that view, essence precedes existence, right? So what it is to be a good person, it precedes or is independent of you as a particular individual. Given that you can't think that if you're an atheist, Sartre thinks the situation is reversed, that your existence as an individual precedes any notion of your essence or what it is that makes you distinctive. There is no, on his picture, no human nature taken in a specific way. I mean, there is such a thing as human nature. There's a difference between humans and snakes and baboons, and those are natural differences. But what there isn't is a natural right way to be, which determines what our fundamental values ought to be and how we ought to live our lives. That's just something which has to be decided by each of us for ourselves. Basically, I think that that's what he means by the idea that existence precedes essence. It's that since there is no predetermined blueprint for how one ought to live a good life, each of us needs to make a decision about how to lead a good life with no authority to tell us what decision to make. So that connects back to the point about the Enlightenment, and also the point about Kantian morality, since the idea was that we need to be the source of morality, essentially. It can't be God. And that was something that Kant thought also. I mean, he had a very different approach in many ways to the existentialists, but nevertheless thought that, again, the central focus is on autonomy and self-legislation. Sartre and de Beauvoir, although I think her picture is slightly different, also think that in the absence of divine authority, or I should add, like authority from nature, in the sense that there's no sort of evaluative human nature, then any claim, any moral claim, any claim about how one ought to live one's life needs to be subjectively chosen.
You brought up de Beauvoir again. Let's bring her into this as well. You mentioned in your book The Woman Destroyed, right? And her introducing us through this to a character named Monique as a way to introduce this idea of living in bad faith. What is Monique's story, and how does it teach us about the concept of living in bad faith?
Yeah, so she's someone who has essentially been badly treated by her husband. So there's a part of the story which I mention in the book, essentially is her thinking through what could possibly explain what's happened to her, and she can't quite decide how she should think about it. So her husband's been having an affair, and she finds this out. She finds it out immediately after her children have left home. So, like, grown-up children have left home, and she's feeling very vulnerable because she's dedicated her life to her children, her family, and then discovers that her husband's having an affair, and eventually he leaves her for someone else. And Monique's attitude towards this sort of swings wildly at various points in the narrative between, on the one hand, being understandably extremely angry with her husband for abandoning her at a point in her life when she really needed support. And then on the other hand, thinking that somehow it must be her own fault because it's difficult to imagine, she says, how I could have given my entire life to someone who could treat me so badly. So I must be wrong. I must somehow have be misinterpreting this. And then thinking, oh, this relationship that my husband has with this other person is very superficial, and I have a much stronger relationship. So then, so these sort of wild swings of opinion. But it seems that throughout, she really does know that he's treated her very badly. And that first reaction I mentioned, that anger, is probably the appropriate one. But at various points, she essentially tries to convince herself that there must be some other explanation, because that's just such a painful recognition that she's devoted her life to someone who really doesn't cares very little for her. And I use that as an example of bad faith, which is a concept which, well, I think it's pretty much common to all of the existentialists, but it's a term which is used by Sartre, and he gives this specific meaning to it. So you can, it's a term which can be roughly interchangeable with the term self-deception. So Monique is deceiving herself at various points about her relationships. But Sartre has this specific notion in mind with bad faith, which relates to his whole picture of subjectivity of what a person is and the centrality of freedom. So he has this famous example of a waiter. If you've read any of Being a Nothingness, you've probably read the waiter example. So in the waiter example, he talks about a Parisian cafe waiter, and if you've been to a Parisian cafe, it's a very plausible description of what many of the waiters are like there. But this person is play acting being a waiter. So they are a waiter, that's their job, but they're playing a role and essentially taking it a bit too seriously, such that they think of themselves as nothing more than a waiter, as like just an embodiment of the role waiter. And Sartre actually has interesting things to say about sort of the interpersonal element of that. Like, we require someone to be nothing more than a waiter because it offends us if a waiter is a real person as well as simply a servant. But the element of this that relates to bad faith is the idea that there's a reason why the waiter wants to convince himself that he's nothing but a waiter, which is that it's a way of denying his own freedom. And something similar could be said about Monique. It's the idea that she's trying to convince herself of like different interpretations of her husband's behavior in order to avoid the unpleasant realization that his actions have been performed entirely freely and have been like morally questionable. But in the perhaps simpler waiter case, the idea is that the waiter is in bad faith because he is trying to escape or avoid the recognition that he doesn't really have to get up at 5 a.m. and go to work each morning. He could just not bother, and obviously he'd get the sack, but that's an option for him. And that's something which Sartre thinks is a thought which causes a great deal of anxiety, because it's an example of the sort of limitless nature of our freedom, that we could, should we choose to, do just anything. There's nothing to stop us beyond ourselves from acting in any way in which our bodies will allow us to do. We try to think of ourselves as being determined or controlled by various outside forces, like, oh, the waiter has to get up in order to set the tables or whatever it is he has to do at a certain time. But really, that's a choice. He's choosing to do that. The sort of centrality of freedom of choice being like the central, crucial fact of human experience for Sartre. And so bad faith involves the waiter thinking of himself as, in a certain sense, having a nature, having the nature of a waiter, and thinking of his actions as being not freely chosen, but rather being forced on him by the sort of thing he is, which is a waiter. And that's bad faith, Sartre thinks, or it's at least one of the most important patterns of bad faith that he identifies, is this idea that we find the limitless nature of our own freedom distressing. It causes us anxiety or anguish. And so we try to hide from it by thinking of ourselves as being having a fixed nature. And that could take all sorts of forms, right? Like there's thinking of yourself as a waiter, which is a relatively trivial one. But throughout their writing careers, Sartre and de Beauvoir describe all sorts of examples of cases in which you think of yourself as not having any choice because of the sort of person you are, um, but engaged in a certain form of action, but that's a form of bad faith. And so all sorts of the analyses they have, I mean, one that I talk about in the book quite a lot is de Beauvoir on gender. It's the idea that, well, I have to act this way because I'm a man or because I'm a woman. And that's what men or women do. That's is essentially, in her view, the same sort of pattern of bad faith, where you take what is in actual fact something that you're freely choosing to do, and then essentially excuse yourself the responsibility of having made that decision by saying that you didn't have any option because of the sort of thing that you are rather, but there is no such thing as the sort of thing that you are, because what you are is freely chosen by you.
Yeah, that's that sort of terrifying thought of existential freedom that Sartre brings in. And I don't have as much opportunity as I used to have to talk about existentialism and humanism, but when I'd get to that section, I would always ask my students, so how many of you like to say, "Oh, I'm not good at math just because naturally I'm just not good at math." And at least half the class would raise their hands. And I would say, "Okay, so let's read this section again and let's think about that. Is there something to your nature that you're just bad at math? Or is there a kind of choice going on here? A choice of you're sort of hiding behind that choice to not be good at math in some way." And for me, that was always perhaps the part that my students found in some ways the most value in, actually, was thinking about, oh boy, am I hiding behind a little bit of my own language as well? That it's just easier to say, I was born not good at math, as opposed to actually looking myself in the mirror and saying, well, maybe I just need to make different choices to become better at math. Um, I always found that to be really just a fascinating conversation to have with my students. This idea of the terror of your choices and having to be responsible for your choices, which is not something that is easy for, I think, any of us. It's kind of built into the human condition. You mentioned in chapter 6, you actually propose what is, I think, a fair question. It's simple as it is, but it's very difficult, which is to say, how is it possible that we have access to the truth and yet we're able to self-deceive? And in some ways, I think if you forced everyone to think about it, it would sort of become an intuitive answer, right? Because in some ways, we all do it to a degree. There's there can be a kind of protective mechanism in that, in living in that self-deception, because we're afraid of what we might become or what we might lose of our own humanity. Should we say to ourselves, it's my choice, that's what I did. I did that. My actions, my choices led to this moment. And so, as a means of self preservation, in some sense, we can use self deception. Now, not always, and it's not something that we should strive for.
Yeah, I mean, I use that maths example sometimes as well when I'm teaching. I think it's a good one. But of course, Sartre is not saying, I mean, it's not his example, but using that example, you're not saying, look, there's no such thing as natural differences in talent. I mean, that would be insane, right? So, you know, there are definitely people who just pick up maths very quickly, and there are people who struggle. Um, Nevertheless, in that with that case, it is possible to do it, even if you're one of the people who find it quite difficult. You just simply need to spend more time doing it than someone else does, and it's easier not to. Right? It's easier to write it off as soon as you get to the point in your education where you don't have to do it anymore. You can just stop doing it, and that's fine. Your life will be okay, and then you can spend the rest of your time going, "Oh, I can't. I'm no good at that." But you could have been good at it. Uh, Nevertheless, there are differences in talent, and I think that that's important. Sartre isn't claiming that every single thing about you and your life is chosen. There are differences between people, natural differences. Some people are taller than others. That's not something that you choose. That's just the way you are. This is what he calls facticity. These are just facts about yourself, which are natural facts, and they weren't up to you to choose. His point about that, though, is that it's up to you to choose how to interpret those, or how to understand those, or what meaning to give to that. So, if you're short, you might resent that fact. If all of your friends are taller than you, you're the shortest guy in the room, you might resent that fact and become angry about it. That's a choice for Sartre. But the fact that, you're 5'3" and everyone else is 6'3" is not a choice, right? That was just the way it is. But it was up to you to interpret that and give it the meaning that you decide. I like the math example. I think it's a good one, and there is so much of existentialist writing, which essentially, I mean, it sounds simple, but it can be, I think, very challenging, like on a personal and practical level, which essentially points out that this thing that you think is natural or is nature actually is a choice. That isn't the only way it has to be. There are other ways of interpreting or understanding what is unchangeable, your height, or your, whatever is a natural facility with numbers that you may or may not have. But there are different ways of engaging with that. And there's always much more on the choice side than you would like to think, because it's easier to say, well, I am what I am, and there's nothing much I can do about that. So why bother trying? Why bother trying to change things, since this is simply the way they are? But the point you made at the end there about how to understand how that's even possible is an important one, and it's very difficult. So Sartre, I said that bad faith is, for Sartre, like self-deception, or is a form of self-deception. But it is genuinely puzzling how self-deception is possible. I think most people think it is possible because we do it. There are people who deny that it's possible, but those are all philosophers, as far as I can tell, because they think there's no way of understanding how it's possible, therefore it must not be. But that's just to deny the plain facts, as far as I'm concerned. Because, when you deceive somebody, you get them to believe something that you don't believe yourself. That's what deception is. But if you are both the deceiver and the deceived, then it's very difficult to see how you could do that, since in order to get yourself to believe the thing that you don't believe, you'd have to prevent yourself from knowing that you believe it. But of course, in doing what you're doing, it's obvious to yourself that you believe it. So there's, like, sometimes known as the paradox of self-deception. And Sartre has some very interesting things to say about how that works. I'm not convinced that he's solved the paradox, solved the puzzle, but he has a lot of interesting things to say. And key in there is this idea that what we do is we have this flexible level of evidence that we're willing to accept. So, and that's perfectly normal. So, in certain circumstances, it can be absolutely appropriate to require a very high level of evidence. In a life or death situation, you really need to be pretty certain before you go ahead and do something. If you're just about to declare war, I think it's pretty important that you have a very high level of confidence that whatever the provocation is has actually happened. Whereas if you're doing something that's relatively trivial, doesn't really matter very much one way or the other, you probably don't need such a high level of evidence before you act or before you form a belief about something. So, what level of evidence we require will depend on the context in which we're in. And Sartre's thought is we use this sort of malleability of evidence levels to our own benefit. So if something is painful to us to accept, we can choose not to accept it by simply saying that there's not enough evidence for that. So set our requirements extremely high. But if something is very flattering to us, we set our evidential levels very low, and we come to believe it's like, most people believe they're of above average intelligence. Why is that? Well, it's probably healthy for people to think that they're above average intelligence. So there's, some reason for it, but it's not perhaps the rational thing to believe. Your evidence that you're above average intelligence is almost certainly non-existent. You once said a smart thing in the pub. And so, we do this all of the time. We set our evidence levels to suit our preferences or to suit what it is that we want to believe. And Sartre thinks that something like that is happening in cases of bad faith. So when Monique is trying to convince herself that somehow she must have misinterpreted the situation because her husband couldn't possibly have treated her so callously, she's setting that evidential bar very high. She's saying, no, there must be, I need further proof before I can really believe that uncomfortable fact. Or when the waiter is thinking of himself as nothing but a waiter, and so doesn't have any choice but to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning, he's setting that evidential bar very low. He's saying, no, of course I'm a waiter. Look, it's on my job description. Therefore, all that comes with being a waiter, being defined by being a waiter, is true of me, and so I don't have a choice about my activities. So that's, again, has sort of like fiddled with the levels of evidence. And I think that that's a very important insight of his, and it's something that I think we have a tendency to do all the time.
Well, I'll say this. I think that there's plenty of evidence to say that this was a fascinating conversation that we had, and the evidence is all, from beginning to this point. Joel, I think this is probably a good place to conclude our conversation. And there's a lot more in your book, and I actually encourage people to get a copy because it's really quite an enjoyable read. And more than anything, I said this to you before we started. I'll say it here as well. The thing that I really enjoyed about your book is the depth, of course, but also the clarity. A lot of people will start reading a book like this, especially something about existentialism, and they'll get lost a little bit in the beginning and find it difficult. But I actually found your book to be enjoyable to read and very clear with a lot to add to the discussion. So let me say thank you for that contribution for the book, but also thank you for coming on today and sharing your knowledge with my audience.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I mean, I'm glad that you thought the book was clear. I mean, that was, to be honest, part of the reason for writing it was that these people, Sartre, Kierkegaard, and so on, are very often very unclear, and it can be difficult to sift through their work in order to find something that you can sort of like clearly state and get your teeth into and think through in a for yourself. And my hope was that was something I could try and help people to do. by writing the book. But yeah, thank you very much. It's been great fun.
Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. Famous words from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is a line that people love to quote today, and understandably so. There is something intrinsically and intuitively truthful about it. Let's think about this line for a second in relation to our conversation today. We'll do so through what is a simple question. If I told you that you are truly free to make any choices that you want, do you find that liberating or horrifying? If it moves you, let me know in the comments. I would love to get a sense of what people think here. Sartre's vision of existentialism promotes the notion of fashioning oneself through his or her actions and choices. In some sense, this is like the first part of Rousseau's line. You're thrown into the world in a Heideggerian sense and born free to make decisions. Yet, how many of you are already thinking, I don't have the freedom to make whatever choices I want. I have a family, obligations. I have limitations of resources, time, and money. How is that freedom to make choices? This speaks to the second part of Rousseau's line, and is everywhere in chains. Perhaps a better question to end this on is this. Are your chains placed upon you by an external source, or have you wrapped yourself in chains as a means of protection? Have your chains become like Linus's blanket from Charlie Brown, something to hold on to because you're scared to actually be free, terrified by the idea that you are responsible for the choices you make and the consequences that follow? Here's an easy choice for you to make. Hit the subscribe/follow button, the like button, and share the show with a friend. In doing so, you get to be a part of a growing community of people who value civil discourse. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on neutral ground. And have a great day. Choose to have a great day, even.